Oh, look at that. The Yeoman's in the shop. I suppose I never did talk about this weapon. Let's get into it. The Yeoman is a lot like the Spyglass in the sense that it's basically a secondary weapon that's really, really good for taking out high health single target enemies like Mist monsters and Mist monsters. You wouldn't want to use this on anything with a ton of health because if you're going against a mini boss or something, it's usually just better to lay into it with a fully automatic weapon. And if you're going against a crowd of enemies, then, explosive weapon or, fast firing primary is again going to be a better thing for that job. And I'm talking about the Spyglass here because when I used to use this weapon way back in the day, it was my Mist monster killer. This thing has an amazing headshot multiplier and it's very, very good at doing high single target damage. And that's exactly what I'd use. So before the Baron was in the game, before I had that movement speed, I would use a fast firing AR like the Gravedigger, was my favorite at the time, an explosive weapon in the middle. I used to have a bazooka for every element, and then I'd have the Spyglass for, headshotting enemies, and it would one-shot, the zappy faces very effectively. And if you had the accuracy, you could take out a taker very, very comfortably. Again, for a smasher, it would just take those hits very, very well like a champ, and usually it was better to just take out like one shot with the sniper, switch to an AR, and finish them off. The Yeoman is a little different though, so let's get into that. My copy is only 106, but the one that I was using was, thank you so much, Genji. He was dropping me a couple of copies of these. We tested it in two different configurations. We had crit damage, crit rating, and then of course we had the damage to slowed and snared 5th perk, and that is a maybe like the highest damage build you could do, but what I really wanted to try was a reload perk, and I didn't want to do crit on this because the weapon fires very slowly. Even with a reload perk, you're going to have about a 1.4 second downtime, plus aiming, you're gonna have about 1.5 seconds or more between every single shot, and I hate rolling the dice on a sniper. I am really not okay with crit builds on this, except for one situation where you could be using this in endurance, and I think I can get that out of the way right now, and that is where the Yeoman can really, really shine. If you're not using this in normal missions, if you need a very strong weapon for the UFOs, I don't have any gameplay of this, I'm not an endurance player, but you can trust me, it does a lot of damage to that UFO, and if you're running crit build on this, that might be the best way to go, especially if you have an entire team of people all using the Yeoman, because you'll have multiple copies, and if 4 of you are taking a shot every single time, 1 of you is going to crit on average, and it's a very, very good way to take out the UFO. There are better other weapons for it though. A lot of people use the Ghost Pistol or the Deatomizer, and none of this is news. I feel like the people who are really running endurance and using it for that purpose already know all of this information, so who I'm speaking to is the guy who's just trying to perk this up and use it in his normal missions. So that brings us to our other configuration, and that is reload, double damage, and damage to Mist monsters, which is a very different build than I usually recommend, but let's explain why that makes sense. So going back to my schematic here, these are our options. At the top, you can go crit rating, which is exactly what we did before. Crit rating, double crit damage is, the other way to go. It does have a base 15% chance to crit, which is pretty high. That's actually really not that bad at all. You're going to have about a 43% chance to crit if you run it with a crit rating perk all maxed out, but again, you're shooting a slow firing single shot sniper, and I really wanted to try out reload double damage, and in my experience, it was actually completely fine. It was two-shotting the Mist monsters in the highest end zones, and there's a caveat there, I'll get to that in a second, and it was doing just fine against the fatties. It would never really fit into my main loadout nowadays, and it's for the same reason that I don't use the Spyglass. So if you are in a, power level 100 zones or lower player, then this is great news for you. I'd recommend double damage on this still. This is going to be a fantastic weapon for one-shotting Mist monsters, and the Spyglass was as well, and is. It's still a fantastic option. It's available in the Pirate Llamas as I'm recording this. You should totally use it. I'll link my video below. But the problem there is those weapons kind of cap out. Like, they're really not one-shotting Mist monsters anymore. In the highest zones, in the 144 players, in the 120 zones, it's just not doing the trick anymore. And so it doesn't really have a place in my personal loadout as an endgame player. But I remember the grind. I remember the struggle. I remember these weapons being very, very effective when I was coming up. And this is a fantastic option if you don't have the Spyglass. Again, it's coming out at the same time as the Spyglass, so it might not be the best option. But you don't have to hit a headshot with this, and it can shoot through multiple enemies, which makes it a little bit more useful in certain configurations. But the reason I never liked it is you are shooting a javelin, meaning it is like a projectile. It's not hit scan, so to speak. So whatever's in your crosshairs doesn't automatically get hit. There's bullet drop on this thing, and you do need to lead your shots. So you have to be very careful with that javelin, and there's a lot less flexibility with being able to shoot through targets, so it gets hung up on trees and different barriers a lot. And that kind of brings me to the best perks for this. So you can go, the crit build like I mentioned, but I don't recommend that. You can go double damage to Mist monsters here. If that's what you're using it for and you're using it for zappy faces, that is something you can absolutely consider. You're going to want at least a reload perk on this, definitely. Reload, damage to Mist monsters, and damage to Mist monsters can be very, very nice if that's your purpose. Reload double damage to Mist monsters can be very, very nice. Or How I would probably use this, if this was my Mist Monster killer, like it was back in the day, I'd roll it very similarly to the Spyglass, where it was double reload, double headshot. I could honestly recommend to you guys double reload, double damage to Mist Monsters, if you're specifically using it to just get off shots on those big targets. This does have a damage to slow and snared option down here, but that's really only applicable to the faster firing weapons, because you're going to shoot an enemy once with no bonus, then again with a 22.5% damage bonus average, and then a third time. I mean, by the third shot, they should be dead, you guys. There's really no point to run damage to slowed and snared on this. Damage to Mist Monsters is the best bang for your buck, or damage to stun, stagger, to knock down targets, which you're going to do a lot. The Yeoman has a phenomenal impact. It will be knocking enemies on their butts constantly, and that 5th perk could be useful to you, but I said my recommendation. You've heard what I've said, and we're going to go from there. Physical could be very, very good, because Zappy Faces can't be elemental, and neither can Takers. So that's a great, your main 2 targets can't have an element. So you might strongly want to consider physical. That's how we were using it in game, and as you have probably noticed by now, it really doesn't fare well against the elemental zombies so much. So you could run energy on this, but I'd never recommend it. To this day, my old favorite Spyglass is still physical, because that's what it was shooting. It was shooting physical targets, and it worked great for that. And as you might know, the physical actually has the highest damage bonus. It's a 44% damage bonus instead of 20%, so you are getting 24% extra damage so long as your enemy is physical. I'll link my elements guide below where I explain that a lot better, but yeah, the Yeoman is, in my personal opinion, this is not anything to recommend, but in my personal opinion, it was always just kind of a worse Spyglass. It does more damage. It has a higher base damage, or at least it did back in the day, but because of how quirky it was, it never really fit on my team. But if you're looking to use it yourself, those were the best perks for it and kind of how to use it. Definitely as a primary, it can have very specific uses for high damage targets. I never mentioned this, but this could be good for the Storm King. So, if you're going to leave a comment on this, here's a timestamp for you. Could be very good for the Storm King if you need to use this on the crystals, but as I've mentioned multiple times now, careful. You do need to lead your shots, and the Storm King likes to move around a lot. So if you're going to be using a weapon for that, you might want to consider the Bundle Bus or the Spyglass or the Old Betsy, which I haven't mentioned at all at any point here, but the Old Betsy is the same thing without a scope. That might be useful to you and might be a closer comparison to the Yeoman. But that just about wraps it up. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista to check out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Hope you guys enjoyed, and thanks for watching. And then